Yo, James is like being. I'm sleeping down here, man.
Remember how you used to sleep? You used to sit on this couch all the time, John. Put all your clean clothes right here.
Okay. If you're on, we got 9 people already. Do me a favor, please. Type your name in there. Remember, you need to be some questions for extra credit. One thing to check out, guys, if you go on my classroom, I posted on the same link for this review session, I posted a PowerPoint, a Google slide. And if you want to, if you have the ability to use it to follow along, you can. Otherwise, definitely check it out later on. I put a ton of videos on it. I put a bunch of hyperlinks on it, some goofy stuff on it. But manifest testing, the whole idea of Western expansion is important enough that, it takes up such a big part of our course that I thought it was something that definitely would be worthwhile spending a little bit of time on. So it's too cold for me to sit out on the back porch today. So coming at you live from an undisclosed location in my house, the undisclosed location being the family room that used to be the family room. Now it's my son's bedroom, but there's nowhere else in the house to go. Like I said, can't go outside, and TV's on up in the living room, and so all right. So again, if you get a chance and you want it, go check out. It looks like this, except it's might be backwards in your screen, and that's kind of how I'm going to follow along as I do this. So tonight we're going to talk about Western expansion, and I put a time frame on it. I said 1803 to 1890, and we'll get into the whys of that time period. If they did give you an essay about Western expansion or about migration within American history, they could do different time frames. But again, I think you'll see there's a very special reason for that. You might want to look at that Google slide also just to help you come up with questions, guys. Okay? Also, if you have any questions, I know I assigned on Test Wizard that DBQ today. If any of you actually did do it today, great. Remember, it is timed if you haven't done it. We do have a couple people who get it extended time, and there is an extended time version for them. But if you have any questions about that, I'll be happy to help you with that too. All right, before we get started on content review, College Board had a webinar. I've been doing a bunch of these live, like they're like Zoom meetings basically, and they've always been at 7 o'clock at night. And they went over a couple things. They're going to be putting out some stuff specific to you guys, practice in terms of how to upload and start the test. They're going to send messages to you guys. They want you on the test itself early. They talked about how the upload will work. There's going to be a timer right up on your screen. I would suggest having something else there as a timer, just in case. The big thing they reiterated, guys, and they're not playing with this, is they are hunting. They are hunting for anyone who does any type of academic dishonesty. What do I mean by that? They know it's open notes. They know it's open book. Don't go trying to copy stuff from the internet. Most importantly, you are not allowed to consult with any adult or student for purposes of taking this. You got your really smart brother or sister who's home from college. You're not allowed to talk to them. They are hunting for people through chat rooms. One of the things that they divulged last night was they've already caught a group of people who were using the internet to plan how they were going to cheat. And the penalty and the risk involved is not worth it. Please don't do that. And you know what? You guys are great kids. Why the hell would you do it anyway? All right. So, again, I need questions for you to get your extra credit. We're talking about Western expansion from 1803 to 1890. I would love to, before I get to it, if anybody could punch into the comment section why I picked 1803 as a start date for a Western expansion review session and why I picked 1890 as an ending date. All right, so let's go back in time. Doodle-doo, doodle-doo, doodle-doo. Let's talk about contextualization. Remember, Garrett, good job. 1803 is the Louisiana Purchase. Yes. Remember, when we do any contextualization, there's two ways we do it. One is we take that exact moment in time, let's pretend it's the Mexican War, and we paint a picture of what are the big ideas and what are the issues that are going on in America at that time, not necessarily related to the essay prompt. You know, you're talking about antebellum reforms, and there's the Hudson River School of Art, and there's stuff like that. So not addressing the prompt, but you're painting a picture of what America's like. The other way is you walk it back a little bit and you explain how we got to this point. And you have to make sure that you connect your contextualization. I was grading some of your DBQ charts today, and some of you gave me like encyclopedias. Which one? Guys, be smart. You can't be spending forever on your gosh darn contextualization. You know, like a real good, legit 4 kind of sexy sentences that have vocab in them. But what I saw was some of you gave me a lot of stuff, but you didn't connect it to the actual thesis, to the essay prompt. So if we're talking about Western expansion, 1803 to 1890, we can take this back to colonial times. All right, remember, really the history of the United States, at least its early history, was moving west. The 7 Years' War was partially caused by, in fact, a large part caused by, efforts and the desires of American colonists to move west. It started when the colony of Virginia wanted to claim land in the Ohio River Valley near what we would call today Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania specifically. And they sent a young militia captain, a 22-year-old kid named George Washington, out there to claim the land. And that's what touched off a fight with France. And that's what started really the First World War. Now, after the war, the colonists were thrilled. Guys like Washington had already spent money, had already bought land in the Ohio Valley. So they thought, great, French are gone, we can claim it. But the British Parliament got freaked out. If you remember, something called Pontiac's Rebellion happened. And Pontiac, who was an Ottawa chief, led this uprising of Native Americans along the Great Lakes. And now, all of a sudden, the British are terrified. You know, they had forts attacked, and they're feeling like, okay, great. Now what's going to happen is we're going to get sucked into new wars. Can you see my cat? Or we have 2. That's Lizzie. She's the small cat. We end up getting the Proclamation of 1763. So now you think about it. There's pressure. Colonial populations have grown. People want to move west. They want available land. And what ends up happening instead is they get restricted by this Proclamation of 1763 that sets the Appalachian Mountains as the dividing line. It says you can't go across that threshold. So the fact that people wanted to go west and that there were barriers in their place already creates an issue. And this is in period 3. All right, let's talk about the American West after the Revolution. A couple years back, I read a great book. It was a great book my aunt gave me because she works at Mount Vernon, and it's called A Grand Idea. It's about George Washington, who thought that the future of America lay if you could create rivers, if you could improve rivers, dredge them out, make them deeper, make them navigable, maybe have canals to connect them. Washington was convinced the Potomac River, the river that Mount Vernon's on, would be the gateway to the West. And it talks about all his voyages out in there. But as a result of the Treaty of Paris of 1783, the treaty ended the American Revolution. Not only did Great Britain recognize our independence, but Great Britain also ended up ceding. That's a good little SAT word. To cede means to give up all the land east of the Mississippi River. In fact, the United States basically controlled all land east of the Mississippi except for Florida, which was controlled by Spain. Okay? 1 second here. All right. When are you guys trying to get a hold of me? All right. So what ended up happening was the Treaty of Paris gave us that land, and now you have a problem. You have all this land. You're going to have to create new states. How do you do that? So one of the 2 links I have in the PowerPoint, one of the ideas of Thomas Jefferson was that, look, you're going to have to create new states, and that those Western lands and how they're organized should be under the control of Congress. And that was an important kind of unselfish move, because remember, these former colonies, now states, had claimed big chunks of land. So that was called the Land Ordinance of 1785. In 1787, you get maybe the biggest accomplishment of the Continental Congress under the Articles of Confederation. You get the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And I've got a map, I've got a link to that. What the Northwest Ordinance effectively did was it came up with a very organized, orderly process for bringing new states into the Union. And it created how you would create a territorial government. You had to have so many people in it. I think it was like 5,000 to have a territorial government, ACAT. And you had to have 60,000 people to apply for statehood. Once you got 60,000 people, you could write up a territorial constitution that could be approved for statehood. There are a couple other big things about the Northwest Ordinance. First thing, they divided up into townships, and each township was like a 6-mile by 6-mile grid. And within that grid, you had all these lots. Well, the rule was one lot in each township had to be reserved for schools, had to be reserved as property that would be used to create a public school. So our founding fathers realized, look, if we're going to be this, quote, and I love this quote, virtuous republic, where you have educated voters, that you somehow had to make sure that they could be educated. The other big idea was that the Northwest Ordinance banned slavery in those territories. And we talked about that recently. All right, so again, this question of Americans pushing west. Now, Americans during the late 1700s, early 1800s were moving west. West meant west of the Appalachian Mountains. There's a gap in the Appalachian Mountains called the Cumberland Gap. You could add in there, the importance of the West. Go to Andrew Jackson. When Jackson was elected in 1828, Jackson was the first Westerner. Tennessee, Jackson's home state, was considered the West back then. All right. If you write an essay about Manifest Destiny, I don't care if it's set in the 1840s, you have to mention the idea that you can't have Manifest Destiny without the year 1803 and the Louisiana Purchase. And I've got a big PowerPoint slide or Google slide on that, but here's the deal with the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Territory was controlled by Spain. France gets it later. We are an independent country under the Articles of Confederation, and even after the Articles of Confederation, the Spanish, just kind of on a whim, will block off the port of New Orleans, which means basically we can't use it. And if you can't use New Orleans, then what good's the Mississippi? That severely hurt American farmers because roads back then were bad. You could be a farmer in the Ohio River Valley. You could be a farmer in, say, like what we would now call like Cincinnati, Ohio, or in parts of Kentucky. The trip by land, although technically way shorter by miles, took a lot longer than put your crops on a riverboat down the Ohio River, take that riverboat down the Mississippi, load them onto a big ocean-going vessel, sail through the Gulf of Mexico, all the way around Florida, all the way up the Atlantic seaboard. Doing this was faster than that by road. So, a couple things happened. Thing one, Napoleon swindles Spain. He says, look, I'll trade you. Give me the Louisiana Territory. I will give you an island kingdom, I think in the Mediterranean. And that way your daughter, King of Spain, your daughter can have her own kingdom. Well, Napoleon basically gives them like a rock with a castle on it. And now he's got Louisiana. And his whole plan for Louisiana was he was going to use the Louisiana Territory to feed Haiti, which was the crown jewel of his empire. A couple things happened. One, remember Toussaint Louverture last year, the Black Napoleon? He leads an uprising of slaves. They overthrow the French. When the French try to put it down, two things stop them. One, Napoleon's men die from mosquitoes. Good old malaria. Two, Napoleon plans to send this massive fleet to, one, reconquer Haiti, and then two, kind of plunk the flag into Louisiana. In the 1800s, the world was involved in what was back then called like a mini ice age. And yeah, we actually had a mini ice age. Climate's change. I'm not getting into that whole thing. And As a result, weather got really bad, and the French fleet was snowed in and iced in, and Napoleon kind of threw his hands up and said, forget this. I'm fighting a war with Britain. I need cash. He told his foreign minister, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, look, go see if you can sell the Louisiana Territory. I lost Haiti. Why the hell do I care about Louisiana without Haiti? Now, at the same time, when Thomas Jefferson found out that Napoleon had basically acquired Louisiana, he was spooked. I mean, Napoleon's not the guy you want in your backyard, to the point where Jefferson actually made an uncoded letter, knew it would fall in the hands of the French, saying, we might have to be allies with Britain. Jefferson then sends Robert Livingston and James Monroe and says, look, go see if you can buy New Orleans. We need to have control of the Mississippi River. Well, the Americans and the French meet up, and instead of New Orleans, we buy the entire Louisiana Territory for $15 freaking million. Okay? Now, this causes a couple problems for Jefferson. Remember, prior to being president, Jefferson had been Mr. Strict Interpretation of the Constitution. You got to follow it word for word. Technically speaking, the president did not have the power to buy territory. So if Jefferson was going to be a strict interpreter, he would have to make a constitutional amendment to do that. Well, and that could take years. Crazy Napoleon might change his mind. So instead, Jefferson channels his inner Alexander Hamilton and says, well, buying land is a lot like a treaty, and I have the right to negotiate treaties. So let me stretch the Constitution, take a loose interpretation, which of course tweaks the Federalists. Jefferson doesn't have the money to pay for this. We're going to have to finance this through debt, finance this through part of Alexander Hamilton's financial plan. And now the Federalists are howling. They're like, dude, you're a hypocrite. But they're scared. They opposed it because they realized, look, all that Western land, they're going to be farmers. And those are going to be the types of people who end up being supporters of Jefferson and his Democratic Republican Party. Now, the other big thing is Jefferson sends a couple guys, Lewis and Clark, to go map out and explore and see, is there a navigable river route all the way out to the Pacific? Lewis and Clark are gone for a couple years. They're presumed dead, but all of a sudden they pop back up. And when they do, the samples, the artifacts, and their diaries they have, it spurs this idea that it's our, quote, God-given right. It's our manifest destiny. And it's the Louisiana Purchase. Thank you, Mrs. Ash. It's the Louisiana Purchase that ends up leading to this whole idea of manifest destiny and Western expansion. Now, we're going to come back to that Louisiana Territory because it's going to come up again and again and again. If we're going to go west, we have to talk about transportation. And one of the slides in the Google slide is about the transportation revolution. Now, Lauren asked me a refresher about the causes and effects of the War of 1812. So we're going to do a little pause, but it's an appropriate pause, and you'll see why. All right, War of 1812, some people call it America's Second War for Independence. Why did it get fought? Well, we were trying to be neutral. Britain and France were at war with Napoleon. So now what ends up happening is Jefferson tries to be neutral, doesn't work so well. So his solution was the Embargo Act of 1807. Epically failed, hurt the economy of New England, especially the Federalists. You have a group of Western congressmen who were the first generation of our leaders to grow up in America as a separate country called the War Hawks. And they're clamoring for war with Britain. They look up north at Canada and they go, look, that'd be a bunch of great states. Along the western frontier, west, there's a war that breaks out with Native Americans led by a guy named Tecumseh. And it culminates at the Battle of Tippecanoe. Well, it turns out when we defeat Tecumseh that he's getting weapons and stuff from the British. We go to war, Star Spangled Banner, Jackson's a hero, Battle of New Orleans. Results, the Federalists die. Go look up the Hartford Convention. You also get the creation of what's called the era of good feelings, where you basically have one political party in America, and that's Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, or we can call them the Jeffersonian Republicans. But the other big thing is, now, because of this War of 1812, America tries to become more economically independent. There's a guy named Henry Clay, and hopefully that name rings a bell. Henry Clay is Speaker of the House of Reps, and Henry Clay proposes this thing we now call the American system. The idea that we need to be economically self-sufficient. Why? Because we had been hurt by the War of 1812. The fact that we were so dependent upon trade with foreign nations, especially Britain. Hey, North, you're going to produce textiles and other things in your factories. South, grow the cotton and the other cash crops. West, grow the food crops. Part of this now leads into what's called the market revolution. We changed the way business is done. Some people call this proto-industrialization. I like to call the market revolution like the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, at least for America. Remember, we're always behind the British. Part of that market revolution included something called the transportation revolution. All kinds of new methods for transportation. People are improving roads. The idea of turnpikes. You pay, kind of like on a throughway today, you pay to use the road. You get a guy named Robert Fulton who invents the first steamboat, which improves transportation. You also get internal improvements. Part of Henry Clay's American system was he wanted the national government to pay for internal improvements. He wanted the national government to pay for roads, canals. Now, Clay never got that part. The internal improvements basically were paid for by state governments, by private companies, by private individuals. But when you have this transportation revolution, if you were to look at a map of the United States during this time period, you will see overwhelmingly these major roads and canals. Later on in the 1800s, railroads, they move in an east-west direction. Now, what's the big thing that kicks off the transportation revolution? The Erie Canal in good old upstate New York, right? Think about it. It connects New York City. I'll go left to right here for you. Okay. Actually, it's right to left on your screen. So it connects New York City in the Atlantic up the Hudson River, where you can use Robert Fulton's steamboat. And then in Albany, you get the creation of the Erie Canal. Canal barges take you all the way past places like Syracuse to Buffalo to the Great Lakes, which means you can go down the Mississippi River. It connects the New York merchant, the New York businessman, with the Midwestern farmer. And not only can you move goods, by the way, the cost of transporting goods plummets. It gets to like 10% of what it used to be. What it also does, though, is it facilitates movement of people westward. Okay? There becomes other reasons for people to move westward. If you can get out west, you're going to see the creation of port cities. San Francisco, Portland, Oregon, where now new steamboat technology, well, actually before the steamboats in the early 1800s, you have these better ships called clipper ships, which will allow trade with other places. Now, let's talk about manifest destiny. If I say manifest destiny, you say, go west, young man, go west. Okay? Got a slide on manifest destiny, good explanation. The term manifest destiny comes from a guy named John O'Sullivan in 1839. I got a little link up there about John O'Sullivan on Mr. PowerPoint or Google slide. The phrase manifest destiny comes from a newspaper publisher, a guy by the name of Horace Greeley. He writes an editorial where he says, look, my advice to you is go west, young man, go west. The idea that the West is your future. The West gives you more economic opportunities. The West gives you a better chance at social mobility. The West gives you a clean start. Now think about context. Why would he publish this? Well, in 1839, you have Manifest Destiny. In 1851, that's when you have the Go West, Young Man, Go West thing. What's happened in between? You've got the Panic of 1837, which would make a lot of people go, I need to get out of here. I owe a lot of money. You have more territorial acquisition with the annexation of Texas. You have the Mexican War, which leads to what's called the Mexican Cession. Another good SAT word. To cede, again, means give up. Mexico gives up all this land. Greeley wrote that Go West, Young Man, Go West in 1851. The gold rush has already happened. So again, the West provides economic opportunities, not the least of which is open land. Okay? The other thing about manifest destiny is there's this belief in American history called American exceptionalism. And I'm going to say that again. American exceptionalism. That we're just different. Think about it. We had no business beating the British. Somehow we did in the Revolutionary War. We're plunked on a continent, and some weird factors allowed Jefferson to make the Louisiana Purchase, and we end up spreading from sea to shining sea. The idea that we're going to spread Lady Liberty, okay? We did, and a short answer question, an essay Q, and on this picture earlier this year, that lady, she's Lady Liberty. Now, my wife, who grew up in a family of artists, she told me that degrees of light are important in history. And if you look, here's Lady Liberty. I know it's kind of sucky, but if you look at my PowerPoint, Lady Liberty is coming from the light and she's moving into the darkness, as in we are the light, America, the belief that we're bringing the light, Christianity, we're bringing the light, democracy, the American way out west along this frontier. So many Americans really believed it was our God-given right to do this. Now, when we talk about Western expansion, I'm going to veer off real quick here. There's a slide on there about the Adams-Onis Treaty. The Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, that's how we got Florida. Good old Andrew Jackson basically took it from Spain, and we said, hey, here's Spain, here's some money. Okay, moving on from that. One of the most important things to remember is as we move west, mo land, mo problems. When Jefferson makes the Louisiana Purchase, he acquires what becomes basically, guys, 15 states. Think about that. 15 states worth of land. And what ends up happening is, because he's done that, you have all this farmland, and now it brings a question. Should that be slave land or free land? And Southerners had become acutely aware of the idea that they wanted to be able to spread slavery out west. Why? Because the North was already starting to grow in population faster than the South. So if you could bring in those territories as slave states, the South would have more representation. Okay? And Hannah, I see your question about the Compromise of 1850. We're going to get to that. Olivia, I have a whole separate slide about the environment. We're going to talk about that tonight. And Helena will talk about why people settle in the West. And Rob, I dig the whole space race thing. Remind me, we'll come back to that. You could do that. I did ask again when they had this AP Live webinar, can you guys go outside? Because remember, the essay prompt is going to be periods 3 through 7. It's going to start, the essay, whatever it is going to be starting in 1754. It's going to end in 1945. They did say, however, for that extra point, that synthesis point, or if you need it for contextualization, you can go back in time to periods 1 and 2. You can also go into, and I asked very clearly about this, can you do stuff for 8 and 9? And they said yes. My thing, Rob, is if you're going to talk about like the space race, you better really make that connection. You have to make it with real good vocab and specific details. Okay. So again, back to this problem of slavery. In 1819, the first part of the Louisiana Purchase tried to apply for statehood, Missouri. And they wrote up their state constitution, but it allowed for slavery. Now, this was a time when there were 11 free states, 11 slave states. You got balance. This causes a big uproar. You hear talk of secession, North and South. They're ready to go at each other's throats. Who comes in to save the day? Good old Captain Compromise, Henry Clay, who comes up with what we call, wait for it, the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise, Maine, which back then was called Northern Massachusetts. Maine, you get to become a state. You'll be a free state. That way, Missouri comes in as a slave state. And the most important thing is, they draw a line across the rest of the Louisiana Territory at 36 degrees, 30 minutes latitude, 3630. And they say, look, south of that line would be a slave state. That would become now Arkansas and basically what was later called Indian Territory, and now we call Oklahoma. The northern part of that would be free. And there were parades, fireworks, parties, cannons. The Union's been saved. But here's the thing. What that did, instead of really saving the Union, was it reinforced a really good vocab word, sectionalism. I mean, now you've officially drawn the line and said slave free. And we'll come back to that Missouri Compromise. Because remember, that's not going to last forever. All right. As we go west, in the 1820s, the Mexican government wanted to settle Texas. They wanted to have more people living in Texas so that they could deal with rogue Indians, they could deal with outlaws, and they made a mistake. They actively recruited Americans. And when they did, those Americans were told, look, you can have free land, no taxes for up to 7 years. You have to convert to Roman Catholicism. You have to follow the Mexican Constitution, including this part about no slavery. Well, most of the people who come from Texas are Southerners, who come into Texas are Southerners, and they start bringing their slaves. And that becomes one of the big causes for this Texas War for Independence. And of course, you had the Battle of the Alamo, which the Texans lost, remember. But it inspired them because these guys knew they were going to die and they were courageous. In 1836, Texas gained their independence and they created a separate country called the Lone Star Republic. That's why that one crappy NFL football team has a star on its helmet. Well, the president of Texas at the time was a guy named Sam Houston. Sam Houston was originally from Tennessee. He thought that the president in 1836, Andrew Jackson, since they're from Tennessee, oh, Jackson's a Westerner, he'll annex us. Not even Andy Jackson would touch that. He knew the controversy Texas would cause. Now think about it. Jackson was afraid of nothing. If Jackson's not going to do it, it might not be a good idea. 8 years later, in 1844, James K. Polk, a.k.a. Young Hickory, ran for president. Polk's a Tennessean. Polk's a Democrat like Jackson. Polk promises he'll annex Texas. But before he can do it, on his way out of office, the outgoing president, John Tyler, another Southerner from Virginia, annexes Texas. We've added in a slave state. Now, in the year after that, there's a little border dispute between Texas and Mexico. According to Mexico, the Texas-Mexico border is further up north in what's called the Nueces River. According to Texas, it's down in the Rio Grande River. James K. Polk, who wants territorial expansion, sends General Zachary Taylor and tells him to blockade the Rio Grande River. If you remember in class, we did the whole, I'm not touching you, does this bug you, thing? The Mexican army gets into a fight with Taylor's men. Polk goes running to Congress and says, American blood has been spilled on American soil. And that's what starts the Mexican War. The war itself is a blowout. We have better guns, we have trains, we have telegraph lines to get signals. The Mexican government has no chance. The Mexican military has no chance. The war ends with what's called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, my favorite U.S. history word. And we take massive amounts of territories. And I've got a slide that shows you the Mexican cession, what will become the states of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and most importantly, California. Now, why do we care about this so much? We talked before about how this causes controversy in America. The Transcendentalists speak out against it. Ralph Waldo Emerson writes Mexico will poison us. Thoreau goes to jail, writes civil disobedience. And there's this young member of Congress in the Whig Party from Illinois who says, show me the spot. He actually presents what's called the spot resolution. He dares Polk, show me the spot where supposedly Mexico attacked us without provocation on American soil. And that young congressman was a guy named Abraham Lincoln. Because Lincoln spoke out against the war, it actually hurt him and he lost his re-election bid. Now, we know that the Mexican War is going to cause controversy. We'll get to that. Here's where the controversy gets accelerated. In 1848, there's a sawmill where you have a running stream, a water wheel that powers a big old saw. You cut timber. And along right about at this sawmill in the stream, Sutter's Mill, they find gold in 1848. Sutter's Mill, California. And that's what starts the gold rush. Now, all of a sudden, California matters even more. Now, all of a sudden, you have a big rush of people coming out there. California says, yep, we want to become a state. Oh, by the way, in the meantime, we're proclaiming ourselves a separate country. We are the, quote, Bear Flag Republic. And if you want us as a state, you have to take us as a free state. And now the poop hits the fan. See, that Missouri Compromise had always kept the peace, but it didn't really say, well, what if we get new land? Do we draw the line further west? And most of that Mexican cession was south of that 3630 line. at the same time, California saying we want to be a state, but we have to be a free state. You also have the issue of 54-40 or fight. There's a controversy with Britain over how far the Oregon Territory goes. Polk chooses not to fight with Britain. He compromises at 49 degrees latitude. We give up a big part of the Oregon Territory. Today we call it British Columbia and Vancouver, even though we actually had like land for it. We had good claim to it. Yet we had fought a war with Mexico for California, even though we had no claim to it. So now in 1850, you have the poop hitting the fan. And now with the gold rush, there's a lot more urgency to get this matter settled. And so there's open talk, again, of secession. Southerners saying, hey, look, you can't take away people's right to own property. Remember, 3/4 of people who fought in the Mexican War owned slaves. So the effort to solve that problem was the Compromise of 1850. Again, Henry Clay is the architect of it. Clay can't get it passed because it's too big. In comes Stephen A. Douglas. He chops it up into 7 parts. Douglas gets each individual part passed. And the thought was that this would settle the question of slavery in the territories and keep the peace. Instead of dumping water on a fire, though, it dumped gasoline on the fire because of that Fugitive Slave Act, which led to personal liberty laws, the Jerry Rescue in Syracuse, New York. And some lady named Harriet Beecher Stowe writes some book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. I see some great questions here, and we're going to get to those in a bit, guys. All right. Then we'll dump more water on the fire. Stephen A. Douglas in 1854, sorry, gas on the fire, not water. Stephen A. Douglas in 1854 kind of revokes part of the Missouri Compromise. He creates the Kansas-Nebraska Act that leads to Bleeding Kansas, the Civil War in Kansas, and the caning of Charles Sumner in the Senate. Again, remember this whole idea about the transportation revolution, how it kind of really makes it cheaper and easier for east-west travel especially. During and after the Civil War, you don't have much left, and then I'll do your questions. During and after the Civil War, the United States government passed policies to encourage Western expansion. A lot of those policies were actually made during the Civil War when the Democrats from the South were out, and that basically meant they couldn't oppose it. So the northern members of Congress, Republican and Democrat, passed the Homestead Act of 1862. The government actively encouraged Western settlement. Under the Homestead Act, you get 160 acres of free land. All you have to do is farm it or build a house within 5 years. The Morrill Land Grant Act, which created land grant colleges. Think about some of those gigantic colleges in the Midwestern part of the United States. You know, Michigan State's got like 40,000 people in it, 40,000 students. These colleges are created for purposes of agriculture and mechanics to educate people so that they can survive and they can do well in the Midwest. The Pacific Railway Act of 1862, which says we're going to build the Transcontinental Railroad. They build it in the North. So again, because the South's not there, because of the Civil War, the Union government is able to get legislation passed. A lot of technology that promotes Western settlement too. John Deere invents the steel plow, which is lighter, which is stronger, which because of its special curve design doesn't get stuck in the ground. And the soil along the Great Plains, although it's really fertile, imagine trying to plow through concrete. Deere's plow lets you get in there. When the old iron plows would break or get stuck, Deere's plow can be pulled by a horse. When the old iron plows are so heavy, they had to be pulled by oxes or horses. A guy named Joseph Glidden invents barbed wire. I've got a little link on that. The steel windmill, which allows you to catch the one natural resource in the Midwest you have a ton of, wind. So you can pump water from the really, really deep underground wells. New method for farming called dry farming. Learning how to farm on very little rain because in the Midwest they get very little rain. The railroads, the most important ingredient in settling the West. They bring goods, they bring people out west, they bring those farm products back east, and of course they'll become the first monopoly, and well, we'll get to that later on. Can't talk about Manifest Destiny unless we talk about the impact on Native Americans. And this is something that spans multiple time periods. Period 4, under Andrew Jackson, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, which forced Native Americans out of their homes east of Mississippi and pushed them out west into, again, what was called Indian Territory. Today we call it Oklahoma. The Cherokee Trail of Tears, the forced removal of the Cherokee Indians that led to a quarter of their population dying, again being forced west of the Mississippi. And the history of the United States when it comes to treaties with Native Americans. Jackson, when he removes the Cherokees, he gives the famous line, he says, "This territory out west of the mighty Mississippi, it'll be yours as long as the grass is green and the water runs." Well, we know that's not true. As Americans move further west, Native Americans are pushed further off their land. You have the Sand Creek Massacre, which happens in 1864, where the U.S. Army basically waits for Native Americans to leave, for the braves, the warriors to go leave, and they go and they massacre a settlement of women and children. The Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868, which we violate. There was a woman in the 1880s named Helen Hunt Jackson. She wrote a book called A Century of Dishonor about these broken treaties, about the genocide essentially committed. And it kind of stirred people to try to help. In 1887, Congress passed what was called the Dawes Severalty Act, which was intended to assimilate Native Americans, blend them into American culture by abolishing the tribal system, getting Indians to move off reservation land, by saying, look, you get 160 acres of land if you farm it, 320 if you graze animals. But most of that land didn't actually end up in the hands of the families of Native Americans. It was taken up by land speculators. And instead of helping Native Americans, it made the situation much worse. By 1890, times had become so desperate, a new religious movement was created called the Ghost Dance, with the idea that if you did this kind of spinning dance, that your dead ancestor would come back and save the day. And it led to one of the worst moments in American history in 1890, the massacre at Wounded Knee, that led to the murder of over 300 Sioux Indians. In 1890, Sitting Bull, the famous Sioux Indian chief, he's killed. If you want a good example of what happens to Native Americans, in 1904, when Teddy Roosevelt gets his second inauguration, his actual first official one, Geronimo, the famous Apache warrior, marches in his parade as like a symbol of the West, where Geronimo was famous for fighting against the United States. Talk about environmental impact. Somebody asked that as a question. Because we have this abundance of land, Americans take an incredibly wasteful attitude towards the environment. You can walk this all the way back to the Puritans. The Puritans, again, believing in predestination, believed that resources had to be used, that they had to be exploited, that if you didn't, you were actually offending God. And we take a very wasteful attitude. Hydraulic mining, using water for mining in California as part of the gold rush. Not just for California gold rush, but for silver mines in places like Nevada. We alter and destroy the landscape. Not only that, but the railroads would actually stop the trains or slow them down so that customers could shoot buffalo for fun. The U.S. government, in an effort to subjugate Indians and force them onto reservations, would pay for every buffalo hide you brought in. They didn't care what you did with the meat. Just shoot them, kill them, bring in the pelt, bring in the hide as proof that you killed it. And the buffalo, which used to roam in herds by the tens of thousands, get down to like less than 1,000. This is going to lead some people, though, to advocate that you have to do something to protect the environment. In the late 1800s, you have an American preservationist. Now, notice how I said preservationist, a guy named John Muir, who says, look, natural lands have to be protected. They have to be preserved. They cannot be done anything with. Muir ends up forming what we now call the Sierra Club. Muir, by the way, will become an idol to a guy later on who's a cattle rancher, a cowboy, and later a president named Teddy Roosevelt. And we know we've talked about Teddy Roosevelt's environmental policy. Some other cool items, just details. The West opens up opportunities. The West is incredibly diverse. If you watch one of those old cowboy movies from the 40s, 50s, or 60s, everybody in there's a white dude. Or maybe the outlaw is somebody who's Mexican. I mean, they're as stereotypical as you can get. The West, though, was the most diverse part of the United States. You have Chinese immigrants coming there to work on the railroads, to work in mines, who are getting exploited and have nativism against them. You have Americans who moved out from the East. You also have tons of Mexicans who come up there to become cowboys. And you have many African Americans. In the late 1800s, many African Americans left the South, tried to get away from the Jim Crow laws and the segregation and discrimination, and they became what we call exodusters. The West was incredibly ethnically diverse. The West becomes a big part of American culture. Buffalo Bill Cody has his traveling Wild West show. They travel through the United States. They travel and they perform in front of the Queen of England. And Buffalo Bill's star attraction was this lady named Annie Oakley, who was famous for her trick shot skills. The West becomes subject of songs tied into the Gilded Age. Remember Horatio Alger, the guy who wrote all the dime novels? He was like the propaganda dude for social Darwinism and the rags to riches story. A lot of those dime novels were set in the frontier. There's an artistic school that gets created in the 1800s called the Hudson River School. That's great context. Art is always good for context. The Hudson River School are an artistic style based upon landscapes, an emphasis on nature, where mankind is small, nature is powerful. Why? Because you're talking about manifest destiny. It's what's on people's minds. People travel along pre-created trails, the Santa Fe Trail, the Mormon Trail, the Oregon Trail. Still one of the greatest video games of all time. The last big detail is there's a guy named Frederick Jackson Turner. He is a famous historian. Historians are great for that analytical point. You're telling these AP people, hey man, I read. So, Turner, in 1893, publishes what's called the Frontier Thesis, with the idea that, okay, look, now that the American frontier has been closed, we have to look back and realize what a sad thing it is, because the whole national history was shaped by the fact that there was always a West. Turner argued that the Western frontier allowed for a release of social tensions. Yeah, we had a civil war, but he compares us to Europe and he goes, look, they're always at war. The fact that there was a West and people could move allowed for that. It made Americans very individualistic, more willing to kind of stand on their own. It made Americans more creative. The old saying is necessity is the mother of invention. And a lot of the great inventions in American history really come because of the needs and the stresses of the frontier. He argues it made America more democratic. And you could argue that, especially women. It's really hard to justify gender stereotypes when if you and I don't work together, honey, we don't get the log cabin done and grizzly bears will eat us. In fact, look at later in history, it's the Western states who give women suffrage first. Turner's frontier thesis has some flaws. It really kind of espouses this idea that it's we're America, a bunch of white people going out there and settling a vacant, untamed savage land, and it pretty much blows off and ignores blacks, Mexicans, and Native Americans. But that's a good reference to talk about the Turner frontier thesis. When you get done with Frederick Jackson Turner, make sure you go all the way through. There's a doofy thing at the end of that Google slide. All right, that's my shtick. Looking here at your questions. Katie, which of the treaties is most important to talk about in a DBQ about westward expansion? In terms of treaties, the one big one I mentioned to you was the Fort Laramie Treaty. I would think more about actions, Katie. Wounded Knee, absolutely. Talk about the Cherokee Trail of Tears. It depends on your time frame. If your time frame is post-Civil War, then it's, late 1800s, it's Wounded Knee, Dawes Severalty Act. If it's pre-Civil War expansion, then it's Indian Removal Act, Cherokee Trail of Tears. Or use them and, connect them and say outside the time period, this is what happened as well. Lily, what's the significance of the gain of the Philippines and Cuba during TR's presidency? All right, let's back that up. TR was not the president when we gained the Philippines and Cuba. All right, 1898, Spanish-American War. Teddy was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, quit, joined the Rough Riders. We gained the Philippines, and the Philippines was important because it provided naval bases for us to have better access, not only to China and Japan, but also so that the American fleet could have bases there to be stationed there. It also created a problem because we're really going against the Declaration of Independence. We're now conquering a chain of islands that's already been conquered by the Spanish. The people there don't want us. They didn't want the Spanish. We never took Cuba, technically. I don't know if you guys remember this, but we did the whole hello puppet thing. In 1898, with the Spanish-American War, when the war started, the anti-imperialists in Congress got passed what was called the Teller Amendment, which said, fine, you can't take Cuba as an American colony. In 1903, after the Spanish-American War, 5 years after it, the Platt, P-L-A-T-T Amendment was created, which then basically said, Cuba, we're going to protect your independence. We'll do it by not letting you have your own foreign policy, not letting you have any foreign debt, and you're going to sign a naval base lease for us in Guantanamo Bay. Now be careful. Do not talk about Cuba with Manifest Destiny and Western expansion. That's imperialism. Unless you're doing like a synthesis thing, Lily. And again, TR is not the president for the Spanish-American War. That's McKinley. Although technically, the Platt Amendment's 1903, and that's when Teddy is president. Logan, what's the significance of the Exodusters? Well, for one thing, Exodusters, again, they're African Americans who escaped the South. This is after Reconstruction. So they're trying to get away from what we call the Jim Crow South. They're escaping segregation. They're escaping sharecropping. And they're a good example of how the West was an opportunity. You could tie them in for an essay about Reconstruction by saying, look, one result of segregation in the Jim Crow laws that happened after Reconstruction was these Exodusters. Proof that Reconstruction didn't work all the way, and therefore people left. The exodus means to leave. You could talk about them, if you're doing Manifest Destiny and Western expansion, as proof that the West was a diverse frontier. Marissa wants to know Manifest Destiny opinions on the president. Well, think of it this way. Polk gets elected because he promises to annex Texas. The guy he beat in 1844 was Henry Clay, who lost because he kind of waffled on it. The guy who comes after Polk is Zachary Taylor. He's a Whig. He's a Southern slave owner Whig. But the reason the Whigs pick him and the Northern Whigs like him is he's a war hero from the Mexican War. Okay? But in most cases, the whole question of Manifest Destiny hurts a lot of these presidents. The guy, when Taylor dies, Millard Fillmore comes in. Fillmore is the one who signs the Compromise of 1850 and that Fugitive Slave Act into law. He becomes a laughing joke. He's so reviled. There used to be a Millard Fillmore Society. They used to gather at his gravesite on his birthday to lampoon how unimportant and irrelevant the guy was. In 1854, Franklin Pierce is the president who signs the Kansas-Nebraska Act into law. We said how Stephen A. Douglas kind of bullied him into it. Pierce is generally regarded as one of the 3 worst presidents in American history. So Manifest Destiny, it builds up a guy like Polk, who says, I'm only going to serve 1 term. And by the way, holy cow, Polk's the president who keeps his promises. We'll have Texas. We'll get more territory, independent treasury. I'll serve 1 term. Bennett, how were imperialism and Manifest Destiny similar? That's great to get that analytical point, what I call the synthesis point. They're both dealing with the question of territorial gain, except now with imperialism, if you think this way, imperialism is phase 2 of Manifest Destiny. We can't go west anymore because there's no more land. We're dipping our piggy toes in the Pacific Ocean. Imperialism is, okay, let's go into the Pacific to the Philippines. Let's go down to the Caribbean. Let's go to places like Puerto Rico, Guam, Cuba. Or let's get the Panama Canal Zone and bully around nations in Latin America. Let's go all the way out to Hawaii in the Pacific. So you could certainly do that. Both imperialism and Manifest Destiny have a war. Spanish-American War for imperialism, Mexican War for Manifest Destiny. Garrett, important events that negatively impacted Native Americans while settlers moved west. Certainly, Garrett, the Dawes Act. And I've got a link on there. Read up on the Dawes Act, because what it really did was destroy tribal system, and it really crippled Native society economically, culturally, until the New Deal with the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. The Wounded Knee Massacre as well. Zach, James Buchanan, how did he affect the slavery debate? Buchanan was a Northern Democrat from Pennsylvania. He's a professional politician. He wanted to just make things go away and save his party. Buchanan is the guy in 1857 who, as he gets inaugurated, is saying, there's a matter before the court's going to settle this. And Buchanan was secretly basically telling Roger Taney, the Supreme Court Chief Justice, make this junk go away. Buchanan was a factor in the Dred Scott decision. Buchanan supported the Lecompton Constitution, the pro-slavery constitution of the, we learned, fraudulently elected government in the territory of Kansas. Buchanan is the president when the Civil War starts and the South secedes. Buchanan is mostly regarded as the worst president in American history, Zach. Gianna wants to know how Manifest Destiny encouraged immigration. Well, I'll say two things about it. One, you can argue it's partially caused by it. Because again, Irish potato famine of 1848. In the 1840s and 50s especially, you have massive amounts of immigration. That brings more and more and more people in. That means population pressure. People are going to move out. But one of the appeals of coming to America was you could very easily move out west. Again, look at places like Milwaukee. How many beer companies are headquartered in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and St. Louis, Missouri? Why? Because those German immigrants come out west. Okay? My favorite barbecued food, if it's done right, is brisket. And brisket is known for, to be in Texas. German immigrants kind of brought some of that stuff with them. And, Milwaukee, they have the sausage races at the baseball games. It's German influences. Okay? Chicago, Mayor Daley, O'Hare Airport. Chicago's still on St. Patty's Day. They dye Lake Michigan green. Let's see here. Anna, synthesis on Manifest Destiny. Any books or songs? Blah, 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 blah. Well, I would say do the negative impact of, you talk about the Transcendentalists. Anna, I would say Hudson River School of Art. And I'm going to get back to that one. Okay, Olivia, I hope I answered your question about how Manifest Destiny affected the environment. Hannah, Compromise of 1850. How did the North benefit? Well, California would be a free state. That was the most positive part of the Compromise of 1850. The buying and selling of slaves in Washington, D.C. became illegal. You could still own slaves in D.C., but one of the things that really, obviously, for obvious reasons, irritated Northerners was you could be across the street from where Congress was doing business in the Capitol building, and slave auctions were being held right on the street. No more buying and selling of slaves. But for the most part, the North was really tweaked, really angry about the compromise, especially because of that Fugitive Slave Act. Again, think about the Jerry Rescue in Syracuse. It led to Uncle Tom's Cabin being written. Blah, 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 blah. Helena, I hope I answered your question about what encouraged people to settle. If not, look at technology, look at government policies. And who was it? I had a great question here. Jake, did people ever migrate back east? Oh, heck yes. In fact, Jake, most of the people who tried to go out to California for the gold rush never got there. They were flat broke. That journey, it's not like, okay, road trip, put it on your credit card, my butt's going to hurt because I'm in the car so darn long. Jake, you're talking about a journey that would take months and months and months, and if you didn't cross the Sierra Nevada mountains before winter hit, you'd become the Donner Party. And if you don't know who the Donner Party is, Google it. Tastes like chicken. But yeah, a lot of people turned back. A lot of people were woefully unprepared. Okay. Jordan, did Louisiana Purchase increase taxes for the debt? No, we financed it. In fact, when Jefferson was president, what Jefferson did was Jefferson eliminated almost all internal taxes because to Jefferson, taxes meant more government power. Brandon, besides the gold rush, were there any events that caused an increase or decline in westward migration? Yes, Brandon, certainly. The Louisiana Purchase is going to increase westward migration. The Panic of 1837, absolutely. Because again, the easiest thing for people to do was pack up and move out west. as you start to increase trade with Asia, it's going to be able to bring more people there. I showed you guys a PowerPoint earlier in the year when we talked about the growth of urban areas. Seattle, which became a major stop on the Northern Pacific Railroad and was a great port for steamships, had in like a 20-year period a 21,000% population increase. How's that for math? But also, Jordan, government policies, the Homestead Act. We'll give you free land. Why? The railroads want customers. Okay? Looking here. I think I've answered all of your questions. I'm going to take a quick pause here and get a sip of my lovely tonic water beverage here. Anyone have any other questions? Did anybody do the Test Wizard DBQ today? If you did, can you give me like a little thumb up emoji in the comments? Or are y'all going to wait until the weekend? Which I'm cool with. I believe I said 11:59 p.m. on Sunday you have to have it done by. Okay. We covered a lot. Hey, check out the PowerPoint. I got some dorky stuff in there, but I've got links. I've got some videos in there. The other thing is, guys, I don't care if you do it on YouTube live comments, you do it on the classroom, you email me, Google Hangouts. Give me suggestions. I have a script of things that I'm running, but I want you guys to be happy. You're the ones taking this test. I got my 5 back in dinosaur days in the 1990s. I want you to be happy. If there's a topic that you would like me to do on YouTube Live, if there's a topic that you want me to put up, something on the classroom, I will do whatever you want. I just need you guys to communicate with me. All right. Other than that, I will see you soon. So log off and plug in your Chromies, homies. Bye-bye.